Hey, welcome to the Kingdoms Podcast. My name is Luke and I host this with my buddy Matt Ma. And our goal is to empower you to discover how your faith impacts culture for God's kingdom. To do that, we're sitting down with different men and women from all kinds of disciplines to uncover how they, through their ambitions and vocational skill set, make a difference in the lives of those around them. And so if this is helpful to you, we'd love it if you could like it, share it, and subscribe. In the meantime, enjoy today's episode. Well, friends, it's a special day because it's not every day that I get to have a conversation with somebody from Texas jumping on the podcast, but I'm here with Hilary Yancey. Hilary, thanks so much for making time to join us.
This is such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Hey, absolutely. And as I said before the recording started, it's fun to get two gingers together in a conversation. I just feel like it's going to be an extra special conversation. Mm-hmm. So no, it's good. But Hilary, I'm confident that there's going to be so much I learned from you today, given your background in philosophy and some of the just really intelligent work you've done in the space of bioethics. But before we dive into all those things and some of the beautiful elements of your own story and journey, I was thinking this week as I was getting the questions ready, I was like, I've got a very important question. This is a question that's important to my wife as well. Given our proximity to recent music events, I really do want to know your take on Taylor Swift's album Midnights. This is crucial. We can't move forward without knowing.
Okay. I love it. I actually really love it. It's funny because I'm almost the same age, a little bit older, I think, or a little bit younger. I can't quite remember, than Taylor. And so I really feel like I've grown up with her music and been there kind of at the different stages. And there's been some neat intersections, not every time, but sort of with where I am, things I'm meditating on, and the things she's thinking about and meditating on. And so there are a few songs right now on that, on her newest album that I just think, I've been thinking about that too. And it's kind of fun just to hear. I think her music is special because it's such a window into what she's thinking about. And she just happens to put it to music where some of us might write it or talk about it or do some other creative outlet. I always feel like it's fun to see, you're thinking about that too. I like how you're thinking about that.
The parallels between philosophy and music writing. Do you have a throwback album or song that you would say, like, looking back over my journey with Taylor Swift, this is my most favorite?
Oh, that's really hard. Okay. I mean,
True say.
Like, all the way back, Teardrops on My Guitar was like the first Taylor Swift jam that I ever loved. And that's a strong contender. But then I would have to fast forward like all the way up to Folklore, which is my all-time favorite Taylor Swift album. That's I listen to that one the most regularly. And for me, that the song she did with Bon Iver on that album just is my favorite.
Seals the deal for you. Well, I have grown to love Taylor Swift myself just because one, as a student at Houghton University, the guys I lived with in my senior year at our townhouse, for some reason, Red had just come out like a year before. And we, for some reason, her breakup song, We Are Never, Ever, Ever Getting Back Together, which was strangely prophetic because we were all about to graduate and head to different parts of the world. But that was like our theme song, but also a little bit more romantically. My wife loves Taylor Swift. And so at our wedding reception, I sang and played guitar, Sparks Fly, just as a little romantic, because that's one of her.
That's lovely.
I know, all the good things. So for those people listening in case you're just thinking this is about super heady stuff when we talk on the podcast, no. Matters of the heart. Taylor Swift.
They got to come first. We got to establish that before we can do anything else.
Now that we're friends with mutual interests. Right on. Well, hey, I'm glad you're enjoying that. And my wife, I know, has purchased the album. And I think this weekend I'm going to be quickly catching up on learning all the lyrics from Midnights. But part of the reason I wanted to reach out to you, Hilary, and have the chance to connect in this way on the podcast is that I know you've done some incredible work in the sphere of philosophy, that you have actually your PhD in philosophy through Baylor University, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Are you a basketball fan? Because they just won the national championship in
2021? So I would say I'm sort of sports fan adjacent. it is hard to be at a place like Baylor and not catch the energy of sports, like of watching the games and enjoying that. But I'm also very much a reader. And so for me, a Saturday night, if I have a choice between watching a game and reading, it's kind of reading's going to win out.
It's probably in the long run the healthier option, not gonna lie. But yeah, so you're a philosopher, you did your PhD, dissertation focused on the metaphysics of the human body, which is just like so much to learn here. And I know that there's a lot of conversation happening in culture right now about the body, how we perceive ourselves, how we treat our own bodies, how we understand what it is to be embodied person, and how that then translates to the way we relate to others. And so obviously, given your studies, I know there's so many directions you could run with that. But I think just on a practical and healthy and holistic level, what are some of the ways that you find yourself speaking into people and saying like, hey, these are some of the negative ways that we can view our bodies or relate to our bodies or to others' bodies. And conversely, here's some of the best ways that you can live as an embodied person and relate to other people.
Yeah. So I think the first thing I'd want to say is that our bodies are not sort of apart from us. So when we talk about sort of how do we live in our bodies, I would almost say that it might be more helpful to start thinking, how do we live as bodies, like as embodied beings in the world? Because we don't tend to ask this about other kinds of animals, right? We don't necessarily say, how does my dog live in its body? Or how does this horse live in its body? We think of them as this entire thing that is just all together. What they think, how they feel, how they move, all of those things are like all touching each other all the time. And, that's true for us too. So I think there's a lot of language that we have just naturally and culturally that sort of says, I am some set of thoughts, feelings, sort of disembodied content. The things I worry about, the things I dream about, the things I hope for. And it's all sort of smashed into this container. And I think that creates some really unhelpful dissonance between those things we're aware of in that kind of more disembodied thinking side. We can get caught up in those and we can ignore the very real things we're also experiencing that are not actually that separated from how we're thinking and dreaming and imagining. So how do we live as bodies might be a good way to ask the question right off the bat. I think our bodies, we have a tendency to either be incredibly suspicious of the information they give us or incredibly trusting of the information we give us. And I think we need, so there's health in discerning that space in between. So you don't need to immediately say like, oh, my body's giving me a signal like I'm hungry or I'm tired. I totally ignore that. My body is unimportant and I just push through all the time, right? We want to actually give ourselves space to consider what information our body is bringing us, how we're feeling and experiencing our physical sort of being. But nor do we want to say at any point I want anything or sort of think maybe this would be a good idea. I should just automatically do it without consideration, right? Our body's giving us information. Like all information, I imagine us sort of sifting it, right? Asking ourselves compassionate, thoughtful questions about it. Am I tired right now? Would a nap help me? Am I hungry? Would food help me? Am I thirsty? Am I sad? Right? Reflecting on the information we are getting rather than only reacting to what in sort of one direction or the other.
Right. It's interesting. You just talk about that, asking yourself thoughtful, compassionate questions, paying attention to what your body's communicating, whether it's fatigue or like a specific emotion. I was reading something Tim Keller posted on Instagram last week, and he talked about how one of the changes in the way people saw themselves as a result of the early church was that before the early church and kind of like the Greco-Roman world, emotions were something to kind of be like mastered and like really tightly controlled and like, or even like pushed down. And that what the early church introduced was really what Jesus introduced was this understanding of seeing emotions as something to be understood, and at one of the main contexts in which we can experience God in really powerful ways. And so I wonder, just in light of the question, Robert, now, if you could touch on that in saying, like, it seems to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, that in like the post-Enlightenment West, there's a premium put on logic and like rationale and like how we think through and the facts that we have. Sometimes there can be a lot of focus on that. But sometimes not as much focus on how do we understand what we're feeling, and how do even our emotions maybe help us understand more about who God is and who we are in that space. Yeah. And so I wonder, could you speak to that? How we understand our emotions shaping us spiritually and inviting us to know God?
Yeah. So a couple of things right off the bat, right? So yes, there are ancient philosophies that have a much like stronger division between sort of embodied realities and what we might call just sort of like purely ideal realities. So Neoplatonism, sort of people who took some of Plato's ideas and then extended them further. Stoic philosophy, which I think actually shows up in other forms now quite commonly. The idea of sort of grin and bear it, or that you are in complete mastery over your happiness is a Stoic idea, because for Stoics, like, your happiness is just connected to your virtue. So if you are virtuous, you will be happy. Your external circumstances, whether you're in poverty or you're experiencing, famine, or you're experiencing some other sort of external tumult, sort of ultimately wouldn't determine it. But not all ancient philosophies thought that. Someone like Aristotle is going to have a view that's a little bit more holistic, a little bit more your being in the world is connected both to sort of your internal virtue, but also the things that happen to you. And that's all obviously just sort of like Greek and Roman philosophy. So it's important to keep in mind that that's predominant sort of in the West, so to speak, or that's sort of what we think of as our inherited tradition, but it's certainly not the only philosophical tradition one can study. But your question, I think, before I got on my sort of philosophical tangent about ancient philosophy, was about whether we're sort of putting like a premium on logic kind of now as opposed to emotional intelligence. I think maybe. So one thing I think of is, I think we are always inclined, and we is very broad. So I want to be careful because I don't think it's true of all humans everywhere, but maybe here's a general thing that seems to be true of a lot of human beings. We are always seeking sort of clarity in our decision makings and a clear line of how am I going to make this decision and on what basis. Logic is a very stable basis for us, right? It's usually pretty unchanging. If you have a principle, you just apply it, right? If the principle applies, you just apply it there, right? If it says do this, you do that. Okay, clarity, great. So I think that in one sense, that clarity is found in a very logical, clean sort of, I think about it, I make a decision, I do it way. And emotions, in contrast to that, can feel very messy, right? They don't necessarily, they're not principled in the same way. They are ways of experiencing the world. I think they give us incredibly important, valuable information. I think they're actually part of seeing the world truthfully, is having emotional experiences in response to the world. But it can feel less clear because an emotion like anger at injustice may not give you an action item right in and of itself. So you can experience anger at injustice, which I think is really important for actually knowing what injustice is. Part of it is reacting appropriately. We should get angry when we know something is unjust. But the anger itself may not give us the next action step. And so sometimes I think because we're always looking for, okay, so what am I supposed to do? How am I supposed to move through the world? We discount the anger because it didn't seem to give us that next concrete step. But here's another thing I also notice. I also noticed that sometimes what we're encouraged to do is fully immediately go off of something like pure intuition. So it's like, oh, do you feel this? Okay, go do it. Or it seems like you should do this. Okay, just try it. And I think that's not necessarily always a problem, but I do think it can be the case that your first reaction to something or your first sort of thought of something you could do, you're like, oh, I have an intuition. I should, quit my job and move, 5 states away and just try something else, because it sort of felt like today on Tuesday, I just wasn't really feeling my job, or I wasn't really feeling content or excited about something. The idea of sort of following your heart, I do think that would be another way of having a path to action. That I think, just like logic has its pitfalls, I do think that sort of like immediate intuition, I'm just going to go with sort of my gut without having a couple of steps of reflection and discernment can also sort of create problems for us.
It almost seems like some of those intense emotions we feel, which are communicating a lot to us, maybe should be treated more like fuel for being poured into wise and discerning steps.
Yeah.
That's fair to say. Yeah. Like in the justice illustration, I wonder that's what came to mind for me. Like, if you're angry about this, anger doesn't necessarily give you the next step, but could you see it as fuel as you take those steps?
Well, I think it's valuable for also knowing that you've really understood the situation. I had a professor here at Baylor who used to talk about emotions as having sort of being contentful. They're ways of seeing the world, and they have sort of information and content in them. So that, anger is not just firing in your brain, right? It's not just creating a feeling, faster heartbeat and frustration and the things we recognize as anger. But it's also, you've seen a thing that's wrong and you are recognizing that it's wrong. And anger is the appropriate sort of sign that you've seen the situation as it really is.
Yeah.
And there's a sense in which if you see the situation and it doesn't move you at all, maybe there's parts of it you haven't yet really seen. That doesn't mean everyone's anger is going to manifest the same way, or everybody's going to have the same sort of embodied experience of anger. What I mean to say is, more generally, having emotional responses to things shouldn't be seen as a liability, but actually I think should be seen as you are understanding and processing part of what you are noticing in the world.
Yeah. Super well said. And again, one of those spaces where I realize, Hilary, your wisdom and experience in the space, I'm just like, it's like I'm sitting down at the big kids table for the first time. Like,
oh gosh, no, don't think about it like that. Everyone is a philosopher. I will hold that line forever.
Hey, I like that.
Yeah.
But I might just be working with crayons in my philosophy work at the moment. Well, Hilary, one of the really compelling elements of your story and your journey that you've written about in your book, Forgiving God, is your pregnancy journey with your firstborn son, Jackson. And for people listening in who are interacting with or hearing about you for the first time and who haven't yet read that book or heard about your story, could you share a bit with listeners about the challenges you faced during the pregnancy and also about your journey of asking God to do something really specific in the midst of those challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had all of my kids. I have 3 kids. I had them all in grad school. Jack was my first, and I got pregnant with Jack a little more than halfway through my very first year. And at the time, we were really excited, had what I would imagine is a fairly familiar experience to anyone who's experienced pregnancy. You go through the first trimester, you're sick, you're excited, you're nervous, you're sort of just in the general thrall of something new and different is happening. And there is a very typical sort of partway ultrasound this is what most people know as sort of the revealing of the sex of the baby. And it's also, and in most cases always is, this very general check.
Yeah.
Everything there? Are the parts working? The heart beating? How's the baby growing? And sometimes that scan will yield different results, and you end up going down a very different path of pregnancy. And that's what happened with us. So at Jack's 20-week ultrasound, they saw some abnormalities, some unusual results, and they had us referred to a high-risk maternal fetal medicine specialist who shared with us that, yes, Jack had and has a number of sort of complex disabilities. Essentially, what Jack has is what's called craniofacial microsomia, which is a fancy word for part of his face grew too small. So Jack is missing his right eye, his right external ear, and some of the bones in the right side of his face grew sort of too small. And so you can imagine, I imagine most of you, that this was really surprising and unexpected. This was my first pregnancy. And I was sort of immediately thrust into a world that felt miles away from what the images of pregnancy that I was seeing on Instagram or that are sort of marketed to you. I had different activities, right? I'm going to regular ultrasounds to check on the baby. I'm talking about NICU teams. I'm talking about cleft lip palate, feeding bottles. I'm talking about pumping. I'm talking about all these other things. While other people are talking about, organic cotton sheets versus bamboo sheets, or how they're decorating their nurseries. And those are valuable, great things. But I remember thinking, I was on the same river with everyone. And then I got on a tributary somewhere else, and everybody else went down the same river.
Wow.
And I just wasn't on that river anymore. And I think the best way to describe my prayer during pregnancy was that God would redivert me back onto the river. I wanted Jack completely miraculously physically healed. I wanted essentially to go in and have him defy everyone's expectations and be born with none of the things they had predicted from the ultrasounds. And I prayed really fervently for that. That was a different experience of prayer for me. I think of most of my prayer life as a single conversation with a lot of pauses. I'll get back to you in a second, as God and I journey together over years and years. And what's interesting to me is that this way of praying was much more fervent and much more demanding. I lost a lot of the language of, if you want, Lord, if it's your will that maybe you think in your great knowledge. And I wasn't asking any if questions. I was telling God to do it. Like, you can do this, and you're going to do this for me. I'm not really even asking. I'm telling you, you have to do this for me. And we could talk at some point maybe about how incredibly freeing that form of prayer actually is. Though I imagine to many of y'all who are listening, that sounds incredibly unusual and maybe even a little bit blasphemous, maybe, to talk to God
there.
like that.
No, go there. I love that. Why would you say it was freeing for you to be, could I say, assertive in prayer with God?
So I think, God, what was freeing was that it was intimate in a way that other forms of very formal prayer and some of our language, even when we are praying informally, separates us from God, right? If God, you in your all discerning wisdom decide that, right? Now we've set this prayer up and we see ourselves as still here. I'm sending this up and hoping you're going to do it, or imagining you might do it if you think you might want to. and then we're waiting for God to sort of get back to us. Right? It's like I'm leaving God a voicemail, and then I'm like, call me back if you decide you want to do this miracle. This was like, I am not letting you put me on hold. I am not leaving a message. I'm hitting 0 for an agent sort of until I get someone on the line. I'm not letting you go unless you bless me, which is right what Jacob says.
Yes.
Before Jacob becomes Israel.
Yeah.
That story's been really important to me. I think God invites us in the, I think of scripture as a series of stories of people encountering God. Sort of fundamentally it bottoms out in that. And it's part of the reason sometimes I think the Bible can be a conflicting, contradictory, confusing, rich text is because it is really a collection of encounters. And not everyone encounters God in the same way. Exactly. And God does not appear in the same way.
Exactly.
But in the story of Jacob's particular encounter, what Jacob says, what it says is that he's wrestling until the day breaks and he will not let go. Yeah. And that kind of audacity is, I think, what God really did sort of create space for me to discover in the process of praying for Jack while I was pregnant.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that intimacy and that kind of relentless holding on is freeing.
Wow. There's a lot of beautiful experience-driven truth there. So you're in this journey, you're crying out to God to intervene. And in a big part of that, you're trusting him to do what you believe is good and beautiful and best. And yet it seems like, I don't want to spoil the story for listeners, and yet that isn't exactly what happens. And so I wonder, for people listening in, and maybe if you could share this through the lens of your own story, what did you do when your prayers weren't answers? How did you let go of old expectations about yourself, about your faith, about who God is, and maybe even embrace new understandings of faith in yourself and who God is in this process of crying out and the answers not being the answers you were hoping for?
Yeah. So I called the book Forgiving God because I think I went through a process of forgiveness.
Yeah.
And people say, how can you forgive God? Right? Forgiveness is about sin, and God doesn't sin, and so you can't forgive God. And to that, I would say, actually, for me, that forgiveness is actually about the restored and repaired relationship. And something can break without the other person having broken it, or even you having broken it, but it still needs to be mended. Yeah. And so for me, the relationship broke. And it had to become a mended thing. And so to answer your question, my thoughts go so many different directions, but to answer your question, I did that forgiving work with a process of grieving those expectations. And grieving those expectations was not grieving my son, and it wasn't grieving the outcome. So I don't think at all that when I was sort of grieving and experiencing, okay, you did not do what I expected you to do. Jack was born with the disabilities that they said he would have, and some additional complications that we walked through in the NICU, and having some early surgeries and all those sorts of things, right? I would say 2 experiences were happening at once. One was I was grieving the expectations that I had had of God's action that had not occurred, that appeared to have not occurred, right? And I was living immediately, deeply, constantly, all the time with the realities of my son and his needs. And that was a space of love and acceptance and passion and fight, right? When you have predictive things. You sort of imagine something's coming. You say to yourself, am I ready? Could I do it? I don't know. People would talk to us about the medical needs that he might have and what it would take to sort of take care of him. And it's easy when all of that information is purely theoretical to sort of be like, whoa, I could never. And I do have a lot of people tell me, right, they hear how we take care of Jack, and they say, I could never. And I actually think what happens is it stops being theoretical, it becomes immediate and practical, and you just do it, right? You confront the reality that is in front of you, and with love and acceptance and almost no need for reflection, you just do it. And so both those things were happening. I was experiencing incredible love and fight and advocacy and delight in my child. And my husband and I were experiencing that together, which is not to say it was a delightful, rosy picture. Not at all. The NICU is a really challenging,
I believe it,
challenging place. But all of that, I'm living so fully in that. And I am looking at God and saying, you didn't do this. And I thought you would. Why didn't you? It would have been good if you had done that. And I think for me, I had to allow both those processes to happen without requiring them to sort of interfere with each other, without requiring them to speak to each other directly before it was time.
Wow. So Hilary, wow. How did you, or maybe how did people around you hold space for you in the midst of that? Where, would it be fair to say, there is this paradox of delight in your son and the gift of his life, even as you're grappling with this tremendous disappointment in God, which, like, I can only imagine the avalanche of diverse emotions in that space. So how did you give yourself permission in that space to be like, this relationship feels broken with God? And, or how did people around you hold space for you in the midst of that?
I mean, one of the best ways people held space was that I would describe them as keeping a watch, without commenting. So, my parents, my family members, my husband, members of our church embraced us and kept a watch. And I don't mean they were watching over us in the sense of, what are we doing? But I mean, keeping a watch, like you keep vigil for someone you care about. You hold them in mind. I think a lot of people held me in mind, without needing to offer me any explanations, any comforts, any language of, but don't worry, God loves, don't worry, God will fix it. God, or, but this is for the best. You need to change something about your experience so that you can still hold on to this truth that, God does good things, or God is a good God. I think what was so incredibly helpful in that, and what I did for myself too, right, was I watched myself. I allowed myself to be in that space as an observer, right, as much as a participant, without needing to rush to the next conclusion. I think we're always rushing sometimes when we're in grief or in suffering to the outcome we think we're supposed to have, which is that, but God is still good. God does good things for his children. And it will all be have worked out for the best.
Here's a nice little bow on top.
Well, listen, that may not actually be your outcome. There's a deep possibility and a reality for many that there isn't what you might call sort of a compensating good for the suffering in this life. So it might not be the case that you suffer, but you got this really amazing thing after you suffered, and that made the suffering worth it. Again, it's that clarity that I think we're always seeking. Oh, this was the reason I suffered, so now I'm good with the suffering because I got this thing. I have this closeness with God. I have this special blessing of this or that. And I was really adamant that, sometimes we suffer and that is it.
Yeah.
There's no clear thing we got out of it. There's no clear reason for it. There's no, but I saw God do this or that amazing thing that is the justification or the explanation. Like, sometimes we have to live with things that are not explained to us.
Yeah.
And we can't do any calculations with God or God's activity that are going to make it make sense.
Yeah.
And so for me, what I cherish about what I hope the book that I wrote created for other people was a space of, while you read it, you feel like somebody is keeping watch with you.
Yeah.
In your experience, whether it's of a similar pregnancy or not.
Yeah. Thank you for that. I wonder, so in that space of, could you say mystery?
Yeah.
Like, what was that phrase? Like uncompensated suffering.
Yeah.
That's a great way to articulate it. So in that space of mystery, what did it look like to start to rebuild that relationship with God, to start to lay down old expectations, but maybe take up some new ones?
So I remember really distinctly the first time I made a new demand of God. And I was driving Jack to a doctor's appointment, a regular checkup. So nothing was wrong. This was sort of how are we doing, weight gain, etc. And I was turning left at a busy intersection. And I remember saying to God something like, okay, you're going to be good to my son. You're going to be good to my son. You who speak each person's language perfectly are going to speak his language. You are going to ensure that there are people in his life who speak his language, who know him, who cherish him, and who champion him. You are going to do that for my son. You are going to do that. And I can remember the sort of, I don't know how I would describe it, almost like a return of a joyful recognition. Like, oh, there I am. And there's God. I recognize this again. I am back in the arena with you again. I've walked back in, and now we will wrestle again. And now we will engage, and I will still not let go. And I will still demand and make these big asks because I believe you are a God of big asks. And there's a sense in which sometimes I still tell God, you didn't scare me off, right? And it's more complicated than that. But there is a sense in which I think sometimes we can lose heart in the asking, or we start thinking, maybe I just asked wrong. I asked for the wrong things. So what I should do is try to figure out exactly the right way to ask stuff so that I get what I want. I get what I asked for. God never disappoints me. If I change what I'm asking, anytime I start to see or sense I might not get what I'm praying for, or it might not happen, if I change the prayer, then God never disappoints, right? Then I'm always shifting around. And I think that prayer, when I made that demand, I remember saying to myself, I don't want to change my asks. I just will keep asking. And I won't be scared off from, like, I won't let how you respond and engage with me keep me from asking or make me change what I'm asking for. I will then go to you and say, okay, so you didn't do this. Why not? Help me see the world in light of what I asked.
Yeah. Wow. I love that. Entering into the arena and asking, wrestling, understanding that God is a God of big requests. We can bring those to. Well, thank you for that. I just appreciate how you're articulating your own journey in the midst of the mystery and like the messy and even the majestic of it all. I wonder, oftentimes there can be, well, specifically in Canada today, there's a real pressing conversation surrounding how we respond to people in our communities with disabilities. And in Canada, one of the really contentious ones is what to do with MAID, with medical assistance in death. And many people with disabilities, severe disabilities, like wanting to opt for that, and people seeing this is like the most merciful thing we can do. And there being kind of an attitude that just says like, well, if someone's suffering, what's the quickest way we can just make that suffering stop, even if it's like death? And I wonder, and for so many of those people, they're not journeying with someone in their life that they love who has a disability necessarily. It seems that it can be seen as very much just like, here's a problem, let's try and quote unquote fix it. And so I wonder, could you speak to not the issue of MAID specifically, but specifically to that journey of life with a son who has disabilities, but is made in the image of God, is known by God, is loved by God? How has that journey shaped your perspective of how the people of God, some of whom are people with disabilities, understand that reality in our world in a Christocentric way?
That's a very deep question. Let me see what I can do. Yeah. I've written about this philosophically. I think about this quite a lot. So the first thing that I would say is one of the things that disability philosophy or philosophers who write on disability helpfully remind us is that there is a lot of evidence from individuals with disabilities or disabled persons. Sometimes those terms can be used interchangeably depending on what the person themselves might want to identify as, about what it is to live in a body that is different. I think about my son as having a set of needs. Those needs are slightly less typical than my other two children, my daughters. But as a parent, I am meeting my children's needs. I am getting acquainted with their needs, and then I am doing what I can to meet them. In the same way, I think the church is getting acquainted with the needs of its people and is trying to meet them. I think we do ourselves a disservice when we think, here's this category, disability. It's sort of things that have gone wrong or things that have been bad. No, here are people who have bodily experiences that are diverse. But actually that's true without what we might recognize or classify as disabilities. And the first thing we should do is be attentive listeners and receivers of the information they give us about what their life is like and how they move through the world in a way that maximizes their access to its richness. I think I don't presume that disabilities are eliminated in heaven. I don't think that that's necessarily the case. I think Jesus's resurrected body gives us some really good reasons to think that our bodies actually retain really meaningful, particular marks of having been in and experienced the world through the bodies that we are. And Jesus invites his disciples to see and interact with what we might consider his disabilities, right? His wound and his sides and his hands and his feet. And those sites are actually means of the disciples knowing Jesus as who Jesus is. In the same way, I think there is real room to think that in resurrected life, we will know each other by having bodies that we recognize as the bodies in which we lived and had our experiences and we were in the world.
Wow.
And I think for some people, being disabled is such an experience. And so part of how we know them and how they know themselves and how they relate to God is involving, inclusive of their disability. If that's true, then the church should be the maximally accessible space, right? Because the church is a reflection of what is the reality that is to come, and that is not yet. And so for me, that means we stop praying for their disabilities to be healed. We don't ask that question. We ask, how do we make our space one that is inclusive of your experience? How do we engage meaningfully with the whole of your experience, which includes your disability, but also isn't just your disability? You know, I think what Jack has taught me is too numerous to name. But one of the things that Jack teaches me is the humility of how particular my experience of walking through the world is, how mediated it is through the kind of body that I have. And that's going to be true of lots of other ways of being, right? That will be true of my class and my race and my gender. How I move through the world is mediated by those properties, by those features that I have. And so when I approach any other person and I'm engaging with them and asking them questions and knowing them, I try to come with the humility that how they have moved through and experienced the world is mediated through their lived experience of their body and all the properties that they have that will be different.
Yeah. That is a compelling thought. I've always thought about the resurrected Jesus having nail scars in his hands and his side and his feet as being like deeply symbolic, like Revelation 5, and then I saw a lamb looking as if it had been slain, like before the throne of God. And I'd never considered not only symbolic in terms of that, like they're temporary. Like I think that we will meet Jesus with like scars in his hands and feet, but I'd never considered the implications of that when it comes to what heaven looks like with regards to restored persons and honoring their lived experiences. So I'm gonna have to explore that more.
Yeah, you should.
That's again.
Yeah,
I said at the beginning,
I have a couple papers about it I can send you if you're interested.
Please do. Well, that's why I said at the beginning, I know I'm gonna learn a lot from you, Hilary. So yeah, thank you for that. Hilary, I'm thinking, and this is maybe a bit more of a pastoral question, but I'm thinking of the listeners, women who are listening, who have had a journey of pregnancy and navigated the reality of postpartum depression in the wake of that, or their partners, their husbands who have journeyed with them in that as well, or even broader family members who have been a part of this really tender part of their story. And you've written about the experience of postpartum depression in your own life. And so could you speak to those who are in that right now, or who are walking closely with those who are in that and aren't certain of what it looks like to find a way forward?
I mean, so the first thing I would say is it is a unique but not an uncommon experience. Everyone's actual experience of postpartum depression is going to be unique because your brain and its chemistry, your body and its changes, your emotions, all of these things, right, are unique to you. And you can feel, I hope, some comfort in knowing that it is also not an uncommon experience. Many, many people wake up to the reality that among the changes and transitions after pregnancy, this is one of the things that can happen.
Yeah.
Lots and lots of people are coming to that table and saying, this is happening to me, and this is how it looks for me, and this is how it looks for me, this is how it looks for me. I tend to be very practical. I deeply, highly always recommend talk to someone, find a therapist,
Yes.
find a counselor who is familiar with these questions and can sit and make that very intentional, really helpfully structured space for you to process it. Do not be afraid. I was afraid for a long time before I got on an antidepressant that would be some sort of indication of either its permanency or my inability to sort of self-manage it. But it turns out, you cannot always self-manage your chemistry. The brain sometimes doesn't take up, right, the serotonin it needs to, or sometimes it is overworking or underworking in different ways that just practically, right, we are embodied beings, and that needs a little bit of help, and it's okay if it needs a little bit of help. I would say the things that have helped, there's so many, but the other thing I would say, if this is possible and you or your partner, your spouse, your community have the bandwidth for it, is for there to be one moment or space in your week where there is something you love that you do only for the love of it. Early days after a baby is born, it's incredibly instrumental. You do this for the sake of this. You change the diapers for you're doing so much for other reasons. And it can feel very endless. Yeah. It certainly did for me. It felt endless. I just remember thinking the world is on repeat. Every 3 hours, these things are happening. Every 3 hours, this is happening.
Yeah.
So that's one of the things I want to recommend is if it's 5 minutes or 20 minutes or 2 hours, something in your week that is a love sort of as pure and unattached to anything else, that is just a thing you love. So 20 minutes of reading, just for the joy of it. No reading a parenting book, no reading something for your dissertation or something for school or something for your job, but 20 minutes of reading something because you just love to read it. Or, for me in this particular season, that's horseback riding. I've always wanted to take lessons.
Yeah.
I'm a huge believer in adults having hobbies. I think we don't do enough for the love of the thing. And so maybe what I'm essentially saying is, if you and your community can create a space for you to have a moment of a hobby, I think that can really help.
Yeah, thank you. No, so helpful and so practical. I'm a firm believer in adults having really fun hobbies too, and also finding as many excuses as possible to celebrate big things and little things. Hilary, you've shared so much wisdom here. And again, it's such a gift to talk to somebody with the expertise that you have, because there's just so much for people like me to learn. But I wonder, before we wrap things up, if there's anything else you'd want to add in what you shared. And I'm thinking especially of listeners who resonate in some really specific ways with your story and your journey of disappointment with God, of hoping for certain realities that don't come to pass, of maybe still feeling like they're very much in the trenches of looking for and longing for hope and help. And so is there anything you might add just on the front of, well, what we were touching on, encountering the risen Christ with nail-scarred hands and side and feet, that was formative in bringing renewal and restoration and new life for you, that you might speak just as a word of hope to those listening?
I will say that God is so willing to sit next to you without speaking for as long as you need God to do that. there is so much talking, and I've talked a lot about talking, right? But for that period of time in which I truly thought I have nothing left to say, I don't have any words, I don't have any fight left in me, I don't have any argument. As a philosopher, it's surprising not to have an argument. I remember at some point someone suggested to me, well, maybe it's not a season in which prayer is talking. It's not a season in which being with God requires thinking thoughts towards God, making asks of God, telling God thanks, or, any of those things. Maybe prayer is breathing.
Yeah.
Prayer is being still. Prayer is sitting and watching the bird at your bird feeder. And God is not even content, but is delighting in your willingness to even be present without speaking. And I think what I would want to tell people is, there's not a time stamp on this. There's not an expiration date on how long your grief or your struggle lasts. There's not a time after which you are supposed to sort of pick yourself up and keep going in the way that you went before. You sit as long as you need to sit. And God sits as long as you need to sit.
Thank you for that. Hilary, for people listening in who would love to learn more about the work you do, engage with you online, or pick up a copy of your book, where could they do that?
Yeah. I love hearing from people. So probably the easiest way to reach me directly, if you've got philosophy questions or other questions, is through my website. So that's hilaryyancey.com. You can follow me on Instagram. I'm at Hilary Yancey. And I'm on there some. I say my relationship with Instagram is always, I really enjoy it. And then I absolutely forget to post super consistently. So you'll find me there, here and there. But the most consistent place that you can read my work, if you're interested, is on my Substack. You can sign up on my website, but it's hilaryyancey.substack.com. And I try to write there at least once a week, and that goes right to your inbox. And my book, Forgiving God, A Story of Faith, is available in most places books are sold. You can find it on Amazon. You can, I'll just support my indie bookstore where I live and work. I'm the bookshop manager here at Fable Bookshop in Waco, Texas. And I would love to sign a copy for you if you want to order from us, and we can ship that to you. We don't, unfortunately, ship to Canada, but we do ship everywhere in the US. I know.
Yeah, I was going to say, you probably ship to a city that's very close to a lot of people in Canada.
Absolutely. I can ship right up to that border.
The majority of the Canadian population lives within, I think it's 300 kilometers of the US border.
Okay.
So, yes, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you, Hilary. You have been so wise, so authentic, and just so kind in this conversation. And I'm so grateful that we've been able to capture it to share with listeners. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much for having me. What a joy.